Our next speaker from the wonderful people at Mimecast, sponsors of AusCERT. We couldn't do it without them. Please give Garrett O'Hara a big round of applause. All yours, Garrett.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everybody. We did, on Wednesday, I was chatting to the co-fens guys about how this would go, and we thought maybe Mimecast should have sponsored travel pillows at McDonald's, and instead of me talking, the guys played Whale Song just to get over last night, but thanks for coming along. So I work in Mimecast, and as part of my job, I get to talk to folks like yourselves about security all the time. So we talk about the security stack, we talk about incident response, SIEM, SOAR, all that kind of stuff. But the conversation over the last kind of 18 months, 2 years, seems to always come back to humans. And a couple of things that actually Jesse has kind of already spoken about, I'm kind of going to do a bit of a deep dive into that. So given it's about humans, I kind of want to start with some biology, and specifically the notion of defensive reactivity, which is basically something that happens in your amygdala, or your lizard brain is probably how you guys would know it. And it's the thing that when we didn't live in sort of safe environments like offices, or go to the Marriott Hotel for conferences, back when we were on the planes, we had to fight saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths. It's essentially our emergency response system, and it's the thing that protected us. So the important thing here really is that it's an instinctual thing. It's not something anyone intentionally chooses. It just happens. When there's a perceived threat, this thing happens to us. You will see things like raised cortisol levels, your heart rate will go up, blood flow will increase. So it's the kind of flight or fight response. You're alert, you're going to run faster, you're probably going to be able to fight better than you would normally. But what you probably don't want to do is sit down to do like Sudoku or crosswords or those kind of things. And you can't control this, but it's responsible for many of the issues that we see in terms of that user awareness, the change in end user behavior, some of which Jesse spoke to already. So ultimately, negativity causes defensiveness, and defensive people can't really hear. So humans are awful. Now, by that, I don't mean if people flew in, which many of us did, that we took the armrest from the person that sat in the middle row, or that we put the toilet paper so it rolls to the inside against the wall instead of outside, which is what everybody should be doing. Really mean more in terms of the inbuilt things that we have as humans that can affect how we do things like communicate. So often what we say, we think we've said one thing, but what's being understood is something else. We have to make assumptions. If you didn't make assumptions, you would go crazy, right? There's so much information that flows in any given day that you really have to be able to do that to survive in the world. The flip side is that it actually also causes problems sometimes in terms of the assumptions that we make. Things like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which has been much publicized over the last few years. So that notion that if you're really confident about something, it often correlates to a lack of skill or competence sometimes. And I'm sure everyone's probably experienced the senior leadership where you see a massive amount of confidence, but actually not a whole lot of competence sometimes. So it's kind of a fairly common thing. But ultimately, it's about emotions. And the fact that if we've had too much to drink, if we've had a late night, not enough caffeine or sleep, that we're going to be affected emotionally by that stuff. And that plays into many different things. So things like our ability to make decisions, and good decisions, or understand things like risk. And these amazingly enthusiastic guys who are having a barbecue and also wanted to be in the paddle pool at the same time. If you think about the average security person, a CISO, going into essentially complex operating environments of companies that may have been around for decades, where legacy systems have got their tentacles into all the sort of business operations, that's a really hard environment to operate in and to make good decisions. And being human doesn't help us. Change is hard. At a personal level, anyone who's ever given up cigarettes, it's a nightmare. That thing where you're at a conference like this, but you can go outside and have a cigarette and talk to people, and it's a hard thing to give away. It's a known pattern. It's safe. It feels good. At an organizational level, similar stuff. We kind of know what works, and changing sometimes is hard because often there's that dip in productivity in the short term for an outcome that maybe is understood but is also kind of a bet, because it's never binary. It's never it's going to work. It's always we think it's going to work. So that stuff is hard too. I'm going to really focus today on the communication side of things because that really is where the conversations that I've been having lately seem to land all the time. And the notion that, again, as humans, we get things wrong. You know, we think we're being understood, but actually when you sort of talk to people, they haven't really understood what you've said. We choose the wrong modes of communication. We choose the wrong type of language that we use. And these things are all related, so how they play together is reasonably well understood. You need to make good decisions and kind of understand how we are as humans. After those decisions have been made, they need to be communicated well for change to be effective, and essentially you see the beautiful circle of life take place. So, starting with looking at communicating up or across, depending on where you are within an organization, and I think this reflects some of what Jesse has sort of spoken to already, the notion that quite often when we are trying to get buy-in for projects, spend on technology, really any change or program of works in cybersecurity, you hear comments like Miko yesterday where he asked, the board asked him why they were spending 50,000 euros on security when they didn't have a security problem. And the comment, we don't have a cleaning problem, so why should we pay for cleaners? That points to the problem here. I think Michael also commented, there was a question, something like, are we secure? And that's obviously an impossible question to answer, but it points to a disconnect in communication. A big part of that is the language that we use. So we obviously, in this industry, have our vernacular, it's almost like, it's not slang, but it's the things we use to communicate, and it seems cross-site scripting, it's CVEs, vulnerabilities, all the language and the things that we say on a kind of daily basis. If I'm a business, on the business side, in finance or on a board, that's not my language. My language is productivity, it's the P&L, it's shareholder value, it's risk mitigation, and there's definitely a disconnect there. And you see that. Tanium did a report on this stuff, and the board members for some of the most highly vulnerable companies, when they responded to their survey, didn't know or weren't able to interpret cybersecurity reports. So this is a kind of a well-established problem that exists within the industry. I'm going to point to this book. If you guys haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's by Phil Zongo. He came from governance background, but has written, honestly, one of the best books in terms of cyber resilience that I've seen. And he talks to this notion of how do you communicate and what's useful for a board to understand cybersecurity. So he talks about things like unambiguous and relatable information for a board. He talks about aligning the conversation to a board with business outcomes and business strategy. And obviously that encompasses the crown jewels, the high-value digital assets, but ultimately it has to be a business conversation, not a cybersecurity or technology conversation. The notion of pointless metrics is another big one. So look, we see the thing where people will report in our industry sometimes on the number of spam messages that are blocked per quarter or per month. And it's a big number often, so it could be 5 million, 10 million messages. Is that good or is it bad? If I'm a business, if I sit on the business side of things, I don't really know. What's the impact if that number went up or went down? So making sure that the metrics that are used are not pointless is obviously fairly critical. But ultimately, it's about being brief, be concise, but being relevant to the business in the communications to the board. The other side of the fence then is when you're not communicating up or across is the conversation to end users. And Jesse covered this pretty well, I think. I'm going to echo a lot of what she said. These are the people who sit on the front desk. They sit in HR, they drive the trucks, they're working logistics, finance, legal, whatever it is. They're not us, they're the other people. And there's really two sides, I believe, to the issue here. The first one is that we get a couple of things wrong. So we have people who are experts in security, CISOs, InfoSec personnel, security experts, who are brilliant at their jobs, but then they're forced into I think Jesse called them squishy skills, the notion that they then have to somehow be really, really good at this other thing, which is communication. And I think that's kind of unfair, and it's generally not very effective. We choose interesting modes of communication. We left a little handout there, the little page, which is an example of a security email bulletin, the things that get sent around quite often, on a monthly basis, and I would question their effectiveness, is the reality. It's something that often has to be done for compliance reasons, but there are better modes of communication that are available to us now, things like video, things like potentially face-to-face or instructor-led training, but that's kind of where the conversation needs to go to. And really important that we kind of start to drop the jargon and we use punchy messaging that will cut through to the folks who are generally just not as interested and don't care as much as we think they do. So these are people who are extremely busy. They have their boss who already is annoyed with them because the 10 things they were expected to do haven't been done. So they've got office politics. They've just got so much other stuff going on that when that email arrives in, do they care? They honestly generally don't. And that's where we start to kind of run into problems. And we end up with this guy. And Jesse kind of mentioned the idiot notion. I've heard some really funny metrics within security teams. They're kind of amusing. They don't get shared with the wider team. So one of them was the clown rate, the Muppet metric, variations on the users being kind of silly people who don't really kind of get this stuff. And I'm going to challenge that and say that actually it's not on them, it's kind of on us. And we've used really ineffective communication to an audience that is really generally pretty disinterested. And I believe that comes from the notion of compliance, where really what we've done is a box-ticking exercise. We've got a requirement to maybe have 95% of people watch the LMS video on security. So generally what they will do, if they're anything like me, is they'll play the video on their second screen, and then on the primary screen, they'll just continue working. The little box pops up to say, do you accept that you've completed this module? You tick yes, and you go about your day, but nothing has actually changed. And I think we need to be much more aligned with a behavior change model. And that's much more messy. It's not as clean, but it does use emotion to cut through to get to the end users. And I echo the use of the advertising approach. That works. We know that works. If you think about the advertising industry, they're masters at getting us to buy things or change behavior. They would never use what's on your table there, which is a wall of text. That just doesn't work that way. This isn't a cybersecurity problem. This is very much a human problem where you have important information being transmitted to a completely disinterested audience. So that could be, back when I smoked, I would probably do exactly what that guy is doing, because there was times where I really, really, really just wanted a cigarette. The little old lady's tired. She's not going to see that wet paint sign. She's tired. It's not part of what's important to her in that given moment. Or the Beamer driver. I still don't really know how that happens, but there you go. So this is a human problem, and that's kind of where we are. This is Leo the Labradoodle. He's actually my friend and colleague Ryan's dog. He lives in Melbourne with Ryan. And you can see here he's way more successful than I've ever been on social media. He's got 1,300 followers, and this is a few months old, so he's probably doing even more than that now. But this is the world we live in, where employees don't just have their own social media accounts, but I know many people who have their pets on things like on Instagram, and they have their own accounts, they've got their own followers, and that's kind of where we're at. So what we're actually competing with is these dopamine hitters, the 11-second YouTube video thing, that's what we're competing with. But yet we're still sending out emails that are just dry, boring, and will never resonate with the end users. So you've got Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, Skype, and Twitter. People probably have mobile phones sitting on their desks that's going to beep when a new message comes in on their friends group in WhatsApp, or if somebody likes the photo of the sandwich that they ate for lunch. But those things are constantly happening. So not only do you have really important information that you need to get through to a disinterested audience, but they're also massively distracted. And what you don't have is people who look like this. And there you go. So there's probably some people who know exactly what happened there, and then there's a bunch of people who are wondering, why did people throw airplanes? We actually changed it. Normally we have people just roll them into balls and throw them at the stage, so it looks like they're kind of really not digging the talk. That little sheet of paper on your table, one of the bullet points near the end says something along the lines of, if you throw a paper airplane onto the stage, we actually have a winner here, that you have the option to win a $100 Visa card. So we have a winner, which is Shane Madison, wherever you are. Come and see me. Nice job, Shane. Yeah, round of applause. That was awesome. Like the point of that is just like it's a funny thing, but that's what happens every single time. Some people will have read it, most people won't, and that's kind of the issue with a lot of these comms. So we still talked with Dan Gregory from the Grew and Transfer, or the Impossible Institute last year at the ASA conference, actually, who were supporters of AusCERT. And he used one of the best analogies I've seen for our industry, which is the thing where you get on a plane and the airlines legally are required to tell you this really important information that may save your life. But when people get on the plane, what they're really thinking about is the Long Island iced tea they'll have in the swim bar in Thailand, or that the airplane pulled away from the gate a couple of minutes late, so they're maybe going to be late for their meeting, or will the kids go feral, or will they watch the entertainment system? But it's that rather than counting the number of rows to the exit, which may be behind you. People don't pay attention. So it's a perfect analogy for our industry. A completely disinterested audience, really important information. And what you saw was this transformation where organizations like Virgin Atlantic started becoming much more informal. They introduced kind of cartoony safety booklets in the back of seats. And all of a sudden, people started becoming engaged, and it evolved to the point where you have barely concealed nudity. So this is New Zealand Air. This is body paint, so that guy's actually naked. Same exact legal requirements, but now built into a kind of much more consumable and memorable format. And I feel okay with having a nipple on the screen, given that Miko basically said the full version of MoFo yesterday, and there was a naked person on the previous slide. I was a little bit kind of like, should we do this? But this is where we go. You can see how this works. So there's some considerations here in terms of how this all ties together. The comms to end users, like there's things to think about. The cadence of communications, you want it to be, like in our experience around monthly is good. If it goes too often, it starts to become part of the noise that people just kind of eliminate and ignore every time they see it. The mode needs to be correct. So it could be an email, but the email needs to be written in a way, to Jesse's point, it uses bold, it's got a single punchy message that is actionable and that people will remember, rather than long verbose emails that are full of kind of technical jargon. They don't work. Things like short videos, generally humor is incredibly good at cutting through. Again, pointing to the advertising industry, how often do the ads that we remember use humor for us to kind of relate to them? That's a fairly common approach. And what you want to get to is the state where you've created social norms within the organization that you're in, or trying to affect change within, where people will look to the leadership. And that's absolutely critical, by the way. You need the leadership bought into this stuff, because if they're not, the employees will just look at them and say, well, if they're not doing it, why should I? So what you want to get to is, you look at the leadership, you look left, you look right, and employees realize that if they step away from their laptops, they should hit Windows L. They shouldn't let people walk through the turnstile right behind them. They shouldn't click on every single link in every single email that comes through, even for companies that they're not the customer of. But you build up those social norms within your organization. So I'm going to kind of close out with this notion of advertising. And I was talking to a guy called Lachlan on Wednesday, who may or may not be here, about this. And we got into a conversation about Guinness. So I thought it was a good one to include here in terms of advertising. I'm from Ireland, so I love Guinness. But if I ever had an advertisement sent to me like this, I'm going to zone out. I don't care. It's too dry. It's too wordy. It's never going to change my mind. But if you consider something like this, and I'm guessing Australians may probably remember this guy, the Emperor Nazi Goring, see some kind of smiles and some nods. This is the guy who told his kid that the Great Wall of China was built to keep the rabbits out, and it was built by Emperor Nazi Goring. Like, it was a silly, sort of funny ad, and everybody probably remembers how human and relatable it was. The little kid at the end kind of ruffling his hair, about to get up in front of his class and give the talk on the Great Wall of China. It cuts through. We all remember that. or this lady, Deborah Kennedy, back in 2000, who uttered the now infamous words, "not happy Jan," and they're part of our vernacular. They've become something that everybody kind of knows what that means, again, based on a fairly funny video in an advertising mode that's 20 years old now, but we still use that phrase. So I'm going to say that like lots of amazing stuff has happened. If you look at the technology that's available outside, it's incredible. This industry has just changed so much in the last 4 years. It's astonishing. But I'm going to challenge us and say that actually the part where we communicate and that squishy stuff, that maybe we don't do that as well as we could, and that we need to really look at moving the needle of behavior change or user behavior using behavior change models much more than compliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Please take your Zelda chess set as a
so much.
thank you for that presentation.